Hello and welcome to Story and Writing, Magic and Mania. In this module, we'll be focusing on story and writing for film and how plot, story, theme are rendered in a visual oral medium. We may have to go to the beginning, oh no. The Greeks of the classical period, Aristotle in particular, are credited with formalizing and codifying drama, a visual performance medium of storytelling. However, the origins of dramatic storytelling are rooted in the ceremonies and practices of much earlier tribal cultures and were performed out of a more magical necessity than as a means or purpose to entertain, educate, or edify. Ceremonies in a rain dance or the public bear hunt, where imitation, mimesis of the act and desired result is a form of sympathetic magic, meant to ensure the mimicked outcome. The oldest story, the oldest surviving narrative, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And by the time of the 5th century BCE in ancient Greece, storytelling had shifted from myths and fables to greater emphasis on humanism, focusing on human concerns and affairs. The story and many other aspects of the tragedies and comedies of this period were analyzed by Aristotle, the pupil of Plato, and written down in his work entitled Poetics. Every year in April, a festival known as the Dionysia took place in Athens. This was a festival in honor of the god of wine, Dionysus. And at this festival, the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and others were performed, and a prize would be given to the best play. Aristotle sat amongst the audience and began to note the similarities of qualities in plays that won top honors, those that most pleased the crowds and judges. These observations he wrote down in the Poetics, and it is really the first instance of formal criticism of this visual art form. What Aristotle wrote about, in terms of these tragedies in particular, has become a blueprint to story writing to this day. This is not to suggest a set of rules to follow. The Poetics is not prescriptive. It is descriptive, and writers have built upon, expanded, reversed, abandoned, and varied upon his views. Yet the work continues to guide an understanding of dramatic and cinematic writing. Aristotle wrote that the story was to be rendered through action and not as narrative. In other words, it should not be someone coming out on the stage to tell a story. Instead, it must show the story, the action. Hence, it must be acted out and made visual. Actors may deliver speeches to relate aspects of the story, but these focus on elaborating on and revealing character and motivation and moving the story forward. The character's thoughts are expressed in words, again, meant to do the same suggested above, but adding a quality that distinguishes each character through what they say and how they say it. Dialogue may contain a rhythm, and a particular character's diction might also have song included, this similar rhythm. The stage, the scenery, the costumes, the special effects, the actions from fight scenes to love scenes are the spectacle, or what we see. Aristotle noted these 6 parts to a tragedy: plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. He ranked these in order of importance. That order of importance is reflected in the order I just stated, and indeed, plot is ranked as the most important, followed by character. You might ask why spectacle is the last in importance. One might say that too much reliance on visuals as opposed to story and character can lead to a kind of cheap thrills syndrome that substitutes good story and writing to gratuitous car chases, nude scenes, gore, blood, explosions, etc. Also, sometimes what we don't see is more effective than what we do see. Anticipating the monster before we see it is usually scarier, and glimpses of a romantic tryst is usually more sexy than a bare bulb mechanics of sex scene. So let's look at story and what Aristotle had to say about plot. Aristotle noted that plots also have 6 parts. An exposition that sets up the characters and the situation. A complication, something that occurs to upset the status quo and force an action, sometimes known as the plot thickening. A challenge, the occurrence, whatever it may be, must be dealt with and overcome. A conflict, there are forces opposing each other that are in conflict based on the above. Conflicts may include person versus person, person versus society, person versus nature, person versus herself, society versus society, and etc. The conflict will lead to a climactic moment, the climax. The opposing forces of the conflict come to a head, and something's got to give. Kill the beast, that scene in Beauty and the Beast. And a denouement, the unraveling of the plot, the resolution of the conflict, and the end of the story. And they lived happily ever after. So let's follow that plot structure for a moment. Exposition. Boy meets girl. Not great, but we have characters in a situation. They meet. A complication. Boy falls in love with girl. This always complicates matters and becomes a challenge. And what is that challenge? After a time, boy wants to marry the girl. The conflict is that the girl's family disapproves of boy and won't allow marriage. Sound familiar? The climactic moment, the opposing forces of the conflict meet to settle matters. A fight ensues. The family is impressed by the boy's courage, strength, and determination, and gives their blessing on the marriage. The denouement, boy and girl marry, smiles all around. We can see in this plot line a rising action leading to a climactic moment, and then a falling action from the climax through the denouement. Sometimes we might leave a movie feeling underwhelmed, something just didn't work for us. Sometimes considering the 6 parts of plot may lead to why. For example, if the exposition is too long in setting up characters and situation, or if the characters are too bland, uninteresting, or unrealistic, or the situation in which they are in is likewise bland and unrealistic, audiences might get bored and disinterested. If the denouement, that falling action, goes on for too long or introduces some new action, it may work against that climactic moment, becoming anticlimactic. Perhaps there was no real conflict or it went unresolved. In any case, storytelling will necessitate a good handling of these plot elements. Excuse me. Likewise, in moving through these, the writer should connect all actions in a scene, and from scene to scene, on causality. One action causes an effect that forces another action, and so forth. This cause-effect, Aristotle noted, should follow the rule of necessity, whenever the writer can craft it as such. In other words, one cause should necessitate the effect or action, rather than an action probably or possibly leading to the next action. A plot is crafted in which each action necessitates the next action. Often this takes into account character, the next on the list of Aristotle's parts of a tragedy. The traits and qualities of the character that would necessitate that character to act. For example, a loving and devoted mother has just been informed that her child was abducted. This new knowledge would necessarily lead to the mother doing something, call the police, find the child, etc. Not probably seek or possibly seek the child. Now, if the mother were characterized as kind of loving and devoted, well, the mother would still probably seek the child. But if the mother were evil, she might possibly seek the child or not. Whether devoted, kind of devoted, or not devoted to the child, that character's traits and qualities should determine the actions they take based on the rule of necessity. That character, good or evil, would necessarily take a particular action. That's the best way. That they would probably take that action, not as good. That would possibly take that action, try to avoid that one. Aristotle also noted that plots tend to be either simple or complex, and that the complex plot is the better of the two. A simple plot moves along the 6 parts noted in rising and falling action, but a complex plot includes significant character change in the protagonist, namely a recognition of some kind. He or she was blind to some aspect of themselves, others, or the world, and comes to recognize the truth in some way. And it will also include a reversal of fortune, as Aristotle put it. The protagonist, through her efforts and experience, will move from happiness to misery, or misery to happiness, failure to success, etc., depending on the genre. Also, there will be a scene of suffering rendered in various ways, again depending on the genre. This scene in a romantic comedy might be the one where the lovers seem to have broken off the engagement and are miserable without each other, Or in a drama, the protagonist's profound sense of loss or grief, or of the moral, ethical, and existential crisis they're going through. One last note on story and plot that should be addressed is the use of the deus ex machina, or the God in the machine. This is a cheap ending that resolves a plot conflict through something outside the plot itself, like the conventional God character who is lowered down in a mechanism in Greek drama to declare that all that took place, all the conflict was a dream, or is all resolved, not through the cause-effect rule of necessity or even probability. But I guess, well, anything is possible. Character is next in importance, and Aristotle points out 4 qualities of the protagonist. They should be, for the most part, good. They should be like the reality. They should be consistent in traits and qualities and motivations. Can't just change their stripes. And if their trait is inconsistency, they should be consistently inconsistent. And these qualities must also be proper to the nature of the protagonist. One should note that these qualities were discussed in terms of tragedy and for the stage, where the purpose was to arouse pity and fear in the audience. So the qualities above are meant to produce a sympathetic character, one for whom we root, and a plausibility of motivation and action in the plot that will likewise engage an audience and produce an emotional response, such as fear. At the core of every film, arguably, the most important element in the movie, the story, the script, and it is demonstrably so when we witness huge production films of extreme costs, with high-paid, top-notch actors, state-of-the-art effects, and these bomb at the box office. But more importantly, in our cultural treasury, they bomb because they have no story. An idea does not make a story. Many films seem to start with a great idea. Futuristic human beings become potato chips or something like that. But this is not story. Before we go into the elements of story and writing, I'll put myself out there and declare that the only worthy stories, and the only stories that work, are human stories. Films may have animals as lead characters, as in many animated films and some live action, but they are most often rendered in human terms, given human characteristics and human concerns and conflicts. Writing for the screen is different from writing for the stage and different from storytelling in a book medium or in simple oral tales. It requires an understanding of what the audience can follow in the succession of images and sounds, manipulated, as we have seen in our prior studies, by various elements of filmmaking. And it is the purpose, the guiding purpose, for all aspects of the movie, the essential purpose, which is to show a story. This is not to say that all films must tell story. Some focus on pure cinema, simply recording images without any particular coherence, or a documentary, which is meant to report objectively and various other experimental forms and purposes. Yet it is difficult to get away from making statements, from telling stories in some way. Even in the films just mentioned, decisions go into what to film, what to cut, where to position the camera, etc., even in pure cinema or alleged objective reportage. So how is writing for film different from writing for other mediums? Here are some central differences between writing for film and writing for the stage. Stage plays are primarily about the words. Films are usually more visual. There are considerably more scenes in a screenplay than you can deliver in a stage play. In a film, one can play with the pacing and the time. There's the ability to use different modes of storytelling, flashbacks, flash forwards, nonlinear time, dream sequences, as one of the best aspects of screenwriting when compared to playwriting. Camera and audience, the sense of intimacy and the ability to engage the imagination. One of the tools at the disposal of the screenwriter is the use of juxtaposition. Two images that together tell the story by means of a visual alchemy that cannot be duplicated on the stage. Using a camera to designate the frame rather than the boundaries of a stage, one gains greater control over what is in and out of that frame. Acting, too, is different. In regards, writing for acting, that is, in regards to writing for the actors or the characters, narration becomes less essential and somewhat limited, as dialogue, emotions, camera, specific locations, etc., are able to substitute for description. Likewise, actors can perform and reveal themselves through actions rather than and through expression, as opposed to simply narrating. There's a larger scope available for the screen. Although for actors, the scale and intimacy in a film are much more controlled, the overall scope in a screenplay is much larger than in a stage play. In many ways, writing for the stage can have many limitations in comparison to writing for the screen. But this doesn't translate to a lesser or more limited art form or experience. These limitations become virtues in the stage medium by forcing greater creativity and theatricality in the hands of the great playwrights. We're going to discuss a little bit about story in terms of point of view. A point of view is a shot where the camera is positioned in such a way to give the audience the impression that they are viewing the scene as if they were a character in the film. It creates the effect that the viewer is immersed in the action, as if he or she were directly taking part in the story itself or in the movie itself, as opposed to the use of a deep focus or master shot, where the viewer is placed outside of the events, objectively observing, like a fly on the fourth wall. There are various types of point of view available to the filmmaker. The subjective viewpoint, for example, can be used to replicate the first-person narrative of a novel by showing the action through the eyes of the central character, whereas a more objective experience may be achieved by placing the camera cheek to cheek with another actor or over the shoulder in the film to show what that character is able to see, without necessarily implying that the viewer is actually taking part in their place. A similar type of point of view angle, regularly used in action movies, is where the camera is placed close to ground level, alongside one of the wheels of a speeding car, adding excitement through a feeling of participation in the drama of this chase scene. While these are matters of camera placement and movement, these create the point of view of a movie, just as in a written story with omniscient narrators or first-person narrators. A film may have a single point of view, purely objective or purely subjective, or it may have multiple subjective points of view, as in Citizen Kane, where Kane's story and person are told from 5 different character perspectives, dependent upon each character's relationship to Kane, as well as including a documentary March of Time sequence, and Ersatz objective overview of Kane's life and death. Or as in Kurosawa's Rashomon, where the actuality, what really happened, of a single event is viewed in 4 different ways from 4 different characters who witnessed the event, points of view calling into question, through the use of this, what we term truth. Directors have used point of view shots since the dawn of cinema, and they are a standard part of the filmmaker's toolkit. One of the earliest well-known uses of the technique is in Napoleon by Abel Gance of 1927, when the camera was wrapped in a protective padding and then violently punched around by a group of actors in order to recreate the ordeal of the central character being beaten up. In The Last Laugh by F.W. Murnau, he films from the point of view of a drunken character whose swirling, dizzying, and blurred camera work to capture a view of the world from the inebriated perspective of the character. Some directors, such as Alfred Hitchcock, are famous for using point-of-view cinematography in many of their works to build suspense or to add to the sense of fear they are trying to instill in the audience. The technique is especially beloved of horror and thriller filmmakers, who can use it to show the villain's actions without revealing the identity of the culprit. The chapters on story and writing in your text will give you further insights and understanding of the art of the screenplay. Many viewing options are listed in the index of the textbook for you to enjoy the variety of stories and storytelling techniques. You have 2 assignments that focus on these elements of story and writing for film and filmmaking in your Canvas modules, as well as a quiz at the conclusion. Enjoy your films. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say.